The Atlantic slave trade was one of the most brutal enterprises in the history of the world. Millions of Africans were kidnapped and sold into slavery in the Americas. But why was this allowed to happen, and who exactly was responsible for it? Well, the primary driving force was economic necessity. European colonies in the Americas needed a large, cheap labor force to work on plantations cultivating cash crops such as sugar, tobacco, cotton, and coffee. There simply weren't enough Europeans willing to do this kind of work for low wages. And unfortunately for the indigenous populations of the Americas, their numbers had been decimated by disease and forced labor, so Europeans turned to Africa. There were plenty of people there, but they were free. So Europeans made a deal with the African kingdoms and tribes. They would come to Africa, buy slaves, and then take them back to the Americas. Now, this wasn't some sort of humanitarian effort on behalf of the Europeans. No, they were quite happy to profit from the enslavement of others. In fact, it was the desire for wealth that led to the creation of the triangular trade. European ships would set sail for Africa, carrying manufactured goods, textiles, firearms, and alcohol. These items were traded to African rulers in exchange for prisoners of war or people captured in tribal raids. The Africans were then transported across the Atlantic in horrific conditions, with many dying on the journey and the survivors sold to plantation owners in the Americas. The profits from this trade were then used to purchase more goods, which were shipped back to Europe, thus completing the triangle. Now, it is important to note that while Europeans were the ones who initiated and profited from the slave trade, they didn't actually capture the slaves themselves. That was done by the African kingdoms and tribes who had been warring with each other for centuries. However, the Europeans did encourage this violence by providing the means to capture more people, namely through the introduction of firearms. In addition, Europeans were fully aware that these slaves were being captured in acts of piracy and tribal warfare, but they ignored this and continued to trade with these kingdoms and tribes anyway. The Atlantic slave trade was a complex web of greed, power, and corruption that spanned 3 continents and resulted in the enslavement of millions. It was a dark chapter in human history that we must never forget.